everyone, it's Courtney and welcome to part 4 of the stencil technique class. For today's cards, we are going to kind of be mixing and matching a bunch of things. We're going to be doing some basic foiling that requires very little supplies. You do not need a laminator. You do not need a foiling machine, just some adhesive. We're also going to be doing a little bit more ink blending today, but kind of step it up a notch. Also a little bit of coloring with any medium that you choose. Hope you guys have fun. All right, so for the first technique, we're going to do a little bit of coloring with the honeycomb stencil by Honeybee Stamps. And I am going to just place this over a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I'm going to be using Copics. You can use any alcohol marker here. You can use any coloring medium that you want here. You may just want to change up the paper depending on what you're using. I am going to take an EK Success journaling pen, which is a Copic safe pen, but again, use whatever works well with whatever medium you plan on using. All I'm going to do is hold this in place with my hands and just trace some of these little honeycomb areas. Now you can use any simple design for a stencil here, and I am not going to trace all of these. I do not plan on coloring all of these. I just want to add a little bit of a pattern to my panel here. So once I have carefully traced out all of the ones that I plan on using, which was really only, I think, 5 or 6. So do as many as you feel like. I am going to go ahead and color these. I am going to do very simple coloring. This is not a Copic marker tutorial here, so I'm only going to show you the one here. I like to start off with my lightest Copic color to get the paper saturated. I find that the colors blend a lot easier when you saturate the paper to begin with. So I'm starting off with the Y08 and just getting the paper saturated where my darkest color is going to be. So I just concentrated my shading being in the lower left-hand corner of each one of these little shapes here. Once I had my lightest color down, I'm going to go ahead and add just a little bit of shading with a YR68, which is a very, very orange-ish color. But this will blend out nicely with the rest of the colors, and you won't actually notice that it's actually orange. So I'm going to blend that out a little bit with the Y19 or Y17. Can't remember which one I used, and then the Y35, and then again finish off with that lightest color, that Y08, to fill in the rest of my little shape here. And I did color all of these little shapes, these little honeycomb shapes, the same exact way with the same color combination. So you get a nice pattern, and pretty much all you need to do is add a sentiment to it. So for the next technique, we're going to do a fake watercolor technique. I am using the Folk Dance Stencil by Simon Says Stamp, and I'm going to be working on a piece of Bristol smooth cardstock. You can also use watercolor cardstock for this. I do not recommend using Neenah or any other traditional cardstock, however. So I am going to use some Distress Oxides here. You can use regular Distress inks or any other water-based ink that you may have. Going to go ahead and lay this down. I did use some pixie spray on the back of this stencil so it won't shift around. Going to take one of my blending brushes and go over the entire card panel. You can mix up your colors here if you prefer, if you want to do some ink blending techniques as well. But just to kind of keep it simple and just stick to the technique itself, I stuck to one single color. You can even, especially with a stencil like this, you can use multiple colors and use a very small brush to fill in the individual leaves and flowers. This is very time consuming, so I didn't put it in this video, but it does give perfect, beautiful results. So I'm just making sure that I'm getting in between all of the little crevices within the stencil to make sure that I have really good coverage onto my card panel here. And then I will remove my stencil. And if you're not working on a scrap piece of paper that you can just toss away, you will probably want to make sure that you clean off your work surface first. Because we're going to be adding water to this card panel, you don't want it to pool up around your card panel and have it end up puddling on your card panel. So I did clean up my work surface before adding any water to the card panel itself. All I'm really doing is taking a spritzer bottle here. You can use anything that you have, and just adding a teeny tiny bit of water at a time. So I'm just adding 1 or 2 sprays, kind of waiting to see what it does because the ink will naturally spread because it's obviously water reactive. Kind of want to see what results I'm getting before adding any more water because it will continue to spread as it dries. So I'm just adding almost like a half a spray each and every time I add a little bit more, and then I'll let this card panel dry for about 15 minutes or so before moving on. Here's a quick look at what the card panel looks like once it's dry. I added maybe a little too much water, but you can definitely, it gives it a very artistic look and mixed media look. So for our final card panel here, we are going to be using the Classy Stripes Stencil by Altenew, and we're going to be doing some foiling. So I have another piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock here, and I am not going to be using my Pixie Spray or my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere my card panel to my stencil. Again, we don't want any extra sticky areas that we don't want the foil to be sticking to. So I'm just using the Post-it note tape to tape the back of the stencil to my card panel like I've done for a majority of these card panels. Next, I am going to take my Tombow Mono Multi Glue. I know there's a ton of adhesives out there that you can use for this. Some of them are specifically for foiling, but I find that the Tombow Mono Multi Glue, which I have a ton of in my stash, works great. So I don't feel the need to purchase anything else. I'm just going to squeeze a little bit of that glue onto a scrap piece of paper, and I'm using an ink blending tool with a clean foam pad. But again, you can use one of those dollar store sponges for this as well. Just going to dab a little bit of that glue onto my ink blending tool and then kind of dab a little bit of it off onto the scrap piece of paper. I don't want too much glue going onto the card panel, but I want enough where I can kind of get into the grooves of the stencil. Now it is very hard to see where you're actually applying the glue. And because I'm adding such a light layer, it tends to dry fairly quickly, which becomes repositionable. So you may have certain areas where your sponge or your ink blending tool may stick to those areas and kind of pull up the stencil in certain parts. So you just want to hopefully be able to kind of pay attention to where you've already added some of that adhesive, or work as quickly as you can so that you get done adding the adhesive before it starts drying. So once I have added enough glue, you can see that I needed a little bit more, but it seems like I'm using a lot, but this stuff is super cheap and it does last a long time. So I am going to very, very carefully remove my stencil as well as the pieces of Post-it note tape because again, we don't want that extra stick. And you will want to make sure that you clean off your stencil with some soapy warm water immediately after you add the adhesive to it. When it is completely dry, you can certainly get it off, but it does take a little bit more scrubbing. You may even want to use an adhesive eraser, which is another very inexpensive tool that you may want to keep in your craft room to remove any residue that you have on that stencil. So I did let this panel dry for about 10 minutes to make sure that my glue was completely dry and repositionable. Then I am going to lay my foil directly over my card panel and kind of stick it down with my fingers just enough so that it doesn't shift around. Now this will not be enough pressure where the foil is going to stick to that adhesive enough to show. So I'm going to bring out my bone folder, making sure that the foil is already kind of stuck down and it's not going to shift around. If you don't have a bone folder, that's fine. Use the back of a spoon. That actually works really, really well. It's a flat enough surface and it's going to give you enough pressure to really get that foil stuck down to those areas where we applied the glue. Now it may be a little bit hard to see on camera, but as I'm going over those areas, you'll start to see the lines kind of showing through the foil where that glue was adhered through that stencil. If you don't see it, then apply a little bit more pressure. You should be able to see the lines. They will be pretty faint, but in certain areas, if you're not seeing the lines, just add a little bit more pressure. You can kind of peel up a corner of the foil just to make sure it's sticking, but as long as you can see those lines through the foiling, you should be good to go. So once I had all of the pressure applied to this entire card panel, I will very slowly remove that foiling, and you'll see that you get beautiful results. They are not always going to be perfect, but it's pretty. It's pretty. So that is the foiling technique, and no additional drying time is needed for this. You are good to go. So here is a look at all of the 3 panels that we created in this class today. Our 5th and final class for this stencil class will be assembling the cards. So be sure to check that out. Thank you guys so much. Bye-bye.